Okay, hi everyone, let's get started. I'm Sarah Kent, Chief Sustainability Correspondent at Business of Fashion, and thank you all for joining us today for today's panel, unpacking the findings of the new Higher Ground report from Cornell's Global Labor Institute and Schroders. If you haven't had a chance to read it, we're going to drop the link in the chat. Check it out. There's a lot of really interesting and meaty detail in there. It's really worth reading it as well as listening to this webinar. It's going to be a really important conversation that's shining light on a critical topic, which is how the climate breakdown is going to affect the fashion industry, its investors, and the people who work in it. We have an incredible panel today representing a real cross-section of the industry. I'm going to introduce everyone briefly, and then we're going to go to a video providing a quick overview of the report's finding, and then Jason and Angus, who spearheaded the report, will also take us through what they found before we go to the panel and have answers to your questions as well. So if you do have questions at any point throughout the session, please drop them in the Q&A chat. We'll get to them at the end and we'll try and answer as many as possible. Joining us today is, of course, Jason Judd, who is the Executive Director of Cornell's Global Labor Institute and author of the report, and Angus Bauer, who also wrote the report and is Head of Sustainable Investment Research at Schroders. On the panel, we'll also have Kalpona Akter, who is the founder and Executive Director at the Bangladesh Center for Workers' Solidarity, and Sutanto, who is Vice CEO at PT Brothers. Sorry, I haven't had my coffee yet. And Michael Bride, who is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Responsibility at PVH. So it's going to be a very, very robust and interesting discussion. But we're going to kick off now with a quick video.
The fashion industry is under threat from climate breakdown. The majority of production is done by workers in some of the world's most climate-vulnerable countries. Our research shows that, in these 4 key producing countries alone, a combination of extreme heat and severe flooding will put over $65 billion of export earnings and around 958,000 jobs at risk by 2030, materially impacting brands and investors. By 2050, these earnings and jobs gaps will increase to 68% and 34% respectively if adaptive measures are not put in place. Together, extreme heat and frequent flooding will cut deeply into workers' productivity and health. They will interrupt production and even close factories. This is what climate loss and damage looks like, and it represents material risks for fashion brands and investors. But not all brands and investors are forecasting these risks into their business plans. To date, fashion's climate strategies have focused on mitigating the impact that production has on the environment. But this approach is no longer sufficient. Brand sourcing in these regions must account for the material risk that climate breakdown brings, and then invest in adaptive strategies to support suppliers and workers. Cooling people and factories on a large scale can help workers and manufacturers claw back some of the losses. In Bangladesh alone, these measures could save up to 73,000 jobs and 28% of lost earnings by 2030. Workers also need relief that allows them to get ahead of soaring food costs and help them to avoid waterborne or heat-related illnesses. This is what a just climate transition looks like. Brands and investors must invest in adaptive strategies and share climate risks and costs to limit the impact that climate breakdown will have on workers.
Well, we thought we'd start, Angus and I, with a quick overview of the findings. I'll start with report 1, and Angus will share highlights from report 2. At the beginning, our institute, the Global Labor Institute at Cornell and Schroders, knew that we shared an interest in what climate breakdown would mean for apparel production. What are the risks and costs for workers, for suppliers, for buyers, for investors, and what can they do about it? And in reading the fashion industry's responses on climate change, we found that it was almost all about mitigation. How do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce energy usage, water usage, increase the use of recycled fabrics? And what what that important as that is, what it misses is climate adaptation, and in particular, how folks on the ground who produce apparel and footwear for global consumption are coping with high heat and intense flooding. We know that both are already showing their heads in the major apparel production centers around the world, and that they're bound to get worse. So we focused first on extreme heat and its effects on worker productivity and health. As heat and humidity rise, output slows, productivity declines. Workers can suffer at the low level dehydration, then exhaustion, fainting, heat stroke, and at the upper reaches, heat and humidity together can kill. So we used a measure of heat called the wet bulb globe temperature. This is a measure that combines heat and humidity. And when you put these two together at levels above about 30 Celsius or 31 Celsius in this combined measure, workers suffer significant heat stress. And taking 32 of the largest, most important production centers for apparel around the world, we ran projections with help from Schroders showing how many days in the year, how many days in each year in 2030 and in 2050, the wet bulb temperature, this combination of heat and humidity, would exceed 30 or 31 degrees. And that's the threshold that the ILO and governments are generally accepting as the level at which heat stress really begins to bite and workers' health and productivity really begin to suffer. So how many days in Karachi? How many days in Colombo? How many days in Managua or Ho Chi Minh City or Phnom Penh? How many days above that 30, 31 degree threshold would workers and employers face in 2030? You can see in the graph here the relative intensity of the heat. Top of the list, the largest number of high heat and humidity days happens in Karachi, and it's followed closely by Colombo and then Managua. You can work your way around the wheel. In lots of these places where apparel production is central to the economy, high heat is a problem. And we focused to get a closer look on how this affects workers, suppliers, their governments. We focused on 4 countries, on Vietnam, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And you can see in the paper, in table 1, that in the centers for these 4 countries, the number of high heat days is going to grow significantly by 2030 and then jump again by 2050. In Dhaka, for example, they will face 64 days at this high heat threshold in 2030. And that's already 2/3 higher than the figure for 2014. And in Ho Chi Minh City and Phnom Penh, 2 more examples, their total number of days above this threshold will have more than doubled between 2014 and 2030, and it'll jump again before 2050. So that's heat and a rough measure of heat stress for workers. We then looked at modeling or analyzing future flood effects. And again, we chose these 4 focus countries: Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. And with Schroders' help, ran projections for flooding levels in 2030 and 2050. And you can see in these maps of Bangladesh on the left and a close, or the flood levels for coastal flooding, that's in gold, that upper map. And in the lower right, in red, riverine or rainfall flooding. And this map shows what will happen in these places in 2030 with a routine flood event, what we call a 2-year event, or an RP to represent facilities, factories, apparel and footwear factories. And you can see that already in 2030, the riverine flooding in red is already beginning to encroach on production in the southern part of Dhaka, old Dhaka, and the suburbs to the south and the east. But take a look now at the next slide. This is a 2050 projection. This is 2050 in Dhaka. Again, the gold represents sea level rise or storm surge, and red represent riverine and rainfall flooding. The colors are much darker, which means a significant share of production. Hundreds, thousands of factories in these neighborhoods will be touched by floodwaters in 2050 in the absence of any serious adaptation efforts. And we ran the numbers, not just for Bangladesh, but for all 4 countries. And 2030, there's a 10-year flood, and then it's then followed separately by a 100-year flood. What percentage of all factories would be at risk of inundation of at least half a meter? And the figures were astonishing. Almost a third in both places, 32% in Bangladesh and 31% in Vietnam. Now, because of the nature of flood projections, it doesn't mean that these factories will all be inundated at half a meter. It depends on lots of things, including flood defenses. But these factories, unless adaptive measures are taken, are certainly at risk. Next slide, Isa. This table represents really the center of the first report. We decided that we needed to develop a model, and flood disruption days, the interruption to production at the factory level from flooding, into earnings, into dollars, and then into jobs. And for heat, we used a simple formula that comes from the academic literature. Every 1 Celsius increase in the temperature above 25 Celsius equals a 1.5% decline in productivity. So using that, we can calculate factory by factory and day by day the losses or the decline in productivity earnings, and then we can convert that into losses in the numbers of jobs. We did that both for 2030 and for 2050. And we did something similar for flooding. We take our coastal and riverine flood analyses, and you can see that based on the inundation level, the flood level at the factory, there is a number of disruption days assigned to the intensity of the flooding. And you can add them up across a year, and we come up with a figure that estimates the damage or the loss due to flooding and its impact on new jobs. And then we can put those two together. We can put together the heat effects and the flooding effects, and we get a total figure that shows us, first in 2030, in an industry that fails to invest in adaptation, to invest in technologies that help to cool buildings and workers, or invest in flood defenses. And you can see, even by 2030, the fall in all 4 of these countries, the average across the 4 is 22%. That's a $65 billion fall off between the climate adaptive scenario, an industry that makes the necessary investments, and the industry that doesn't. And that adds up to almost 1 million new jobs that won't be created under the business as usual scenario. And then we look at the same analysis for 2050 using projections for heat and flooding in 2050, and you see the gap between these 2 scenarios, the climate adaptive scenario and the business as usual scenario, swinging way out. It's almost a 70% difference in terms of export earnings, and in the terms of lost jobs, it's almost 8.5 million lost jobs or new jobs. Or I hand it over to Angus. One is that we want to stress that these estimates, our assumptions here are conservative. Every time we had to make a choice in terms of our estimates, we chose the more conservative one, a middle of the road climate scenario, and lower estimates for losses due to disruption days. In the last part of report 1, we look at what governance says about climate impact for workers at the factory level. We look at both what national law says, what private regulation says, what public regulation says, and we found that there are very few rules that are fit for an era of climate breakdown. We looked in particular at heat standards in the factories. That's the view from the national level, and we wanted to have a look at what the effect, what these risks and costs would look like at the brand level, and that we take up in the second. Angus.
Thank you, Jason. So, as Jason said, we sort of wanted to understand both the macro level implications of these challenges and the company specific, or the effects that cascade down the value chain. From where we sit as sustainable investors, we really care about understanding the materiality of these issues such that we can build them into investment practice, such that we can engage with companies, our investee companies, on these particular topics. And so when we were seeking to sort of move into report 2 territory to really try and isolate, what are the effects being felt at company level, either by brands themselves or by suppliers, we thought, well, first of all, we need to select a wide variety of different types of fashion business model, as well as an array of companies that had different geographical concentration, such that we could work out whether or not the effects of extreme heat and flooding were pervasive, such that we could work out whether or not there were certain types of business model or product, for example, that were better or worse insulated. But long story short, as you can see here on the slide, the reality of the conclusion that we came to is that across most types of business model that we assessed, whether it's online only, whether it's sportswear, whether it's the value end of the spectrum or the mid-market end of the spectrum, brands are exposed to these issues, both exposed to extreme heat, as you see on the right-hand side, well, on the left-hand side of each of the dated columns, and also exposed to extreme flooding. Now, this is quite a sort of stark reality when you look at an industry that has been, throughout its existence, externalizing a lot of the cost of growth and a lot of the social costs of that growth over time. We have, in some of these instances, certain companies in our sample that by the time we get to 2050 are looking at a double-digit percentage of their supplier factories experiencing more than 30.5 degree wet bulb heat. Now, as Jason already alluded to, that amounts to a fairly significant productivity headwind in terms of the experience of the workers on the floor in those factories, if those factories have failed to adapt. But after finding this, if we move to the next slide, please, we sort of really wanted to try and unpack what was the nature of the risks? Really, when we look at flooding, what was the type of flooding that was affecting these individual supplier facilities in the timeframes that we were modeling? How many days worth of extreme heat were there for each of these companies? Because, the first question being, which brands are affected, what proportions of their supply chain footprint is affected? The next question is then, well, actually, what is this costing? What is the quote unquote value at risk here for the different actors in the supply chain? And that was where we, excuse me, again, looking back to the equation that Jason mentioned involving the degree of productivity loss associated with increases in temperatures. We also lent on a variety of literature that looks at how to model the damage function associated with flood risk, looking at how many days when you have a particular level of flood it takes for the water to discharge, and then how many days it takes to recover the productivity associated with that factory before you can get back up and running. We built using the disclosures of one particular brand in our sample set, we built a bottom-up set of estimates to try and gauge the dollar value at risk associated with both extreme heat and flooding in a couple of production centers where we had sufficient disclosure to do so. So that's where we got to quite some important conclusions, I would say, because we found that for the brand in question, we estimated the costs associated with heat and flood risk in 2030 to be equivalent to approximately 3 percentage points of their forecast cost of goods sold. So that is the cost of sales or the procurement spend for that particular brand. And what was interesting about this to us was that 3 percentage points of domestic cost of goods sold was equivalent to approximately 5% of the group's total net operating profit after tax, assuming a through cycle margin. So, actually the numbers that we're talking about here, they may sound small, 1.5% of revenues, 3% of cost of goods sold, 5% of net operating profit. They may sound small, but actually in investment terms, if we think about the effects of these compounding year over year, quite possibly becoming worse as the number of heat exceedance days or the depth and interruption days associated with floods increase, these effects start to compound quite materially over time. And they are, in our view, significant enough for investors to be engaging on these topics, and the brands themselves to be working with suppliers to address the acute needs of adaptation. The final thing also to mention just on these numbers is that where a brand is experiencing a cost headwind associated with 3 percentage points of its cost of sales, that 3% is effectively equivalent to 3 percentage points of a supplier's revenue stream. And what is even more important almost is that actually when you look at the margin profiles and you unpick the margin profiles of suppliers in these exposed areas, their capacity to potentially bear incremental cost associated with these risks is even more limited because they operate on even tighter margin profiles. So, the second sort of question after looking to understand who is exposed here, what is the extent of this exposure, that raised significant conclusions around just the extent of the materiality of this issue. The next step, therefore, was then to say, well, okay, what do we think is going on? What can we see in terms of action from the industry here? Are we able to identify instances where brands are starting to adapt? How has the industry historically grown and changed over time? Where does the balance of power lie? And really, what is the potential set of choices that brands have, or brands and suppliers, if they choose to work with their suppliers? What is the range of choices that face them when it comes to investing in the adaptation solutions associated with dealing with some of these negative consequences? We found a range of approaches that are being taken thus far by brands with regard to climate risk in general, particularly when you interrogate brand TCFD reports. You get a lot of information about scenario analyses and the risks that are being identified by individual brands. And as is written throughout both the first and second reports, a lot of the information that is being delivered and identified or targeted by brands pertains to mitigation. And actually what we found were a variety of gaps associated with adaptation. It is rare in our experience, having done this work, to find detailed, fully thought out adaptation plans that deal with the risks that we have identified associated with extreme heat and flooding. Oftentimes, heat and flooding have been identified by companies in the supply chain, but they most often focus on the effects on raw materials rather than necessarily the effects on suppliers and their workers. So, we think that this is potentially a little bit of a blind spot. We think that there are material issues here, and we do believe, following fairly extensive investigation of the adaptation solutions with different experts and people on the ground out in these centers, that there are potentially some quite positive ROI equations associated with the investment in adaptation, which really leads us on to quite a constructive set of conclusions, because the risk here is quite profound, but these are potentially costs that as we all know, having seen the news flow over the last 3 to 4 months, these are quite potentially costs that are already being felt across the industry to some degree. So, the reality is we believe that there is a good deal of upside here associated with effective adaptation. But what that requires is action from multiple different stakeholders. So the final part of our report, the second report, really is set out to dig into what can be done here and what we as investors can recommend for different actors in the supply chain. And really for brands and suppliers, our core recommendation is that both parties explore the returns on investment associated with different adaptation measures, and that brands support suppliers either to retrofit or relocate nearby in lower risk locations. Similarly, for investors, we are encouraging investors across the board to engage with apparel companies and the other relevant stakeholders of apparel companies to encourage adaptation, to encourage the to encourage the measurement of these climate-related risks today, and to give effective reporting such that investors can really understand the magnitude of these effects. Jason, I'll pass back to you for some of the additional macro-level recommendations.
Thanks. Just two, and this first one is general. It applies to all the constituents in the fashion industry. And it's to treat heat and flooding events as health hazards, and that means changes in most places to workplace temperature standards and protocols. We catalog in report 1 what those standards are, and we find that in most places they're vague or missing altogether. So changes in temperature standards and protocols for high heat and flooding. That means changes in work hours, in leave policy, in rules for worker rest and hydration, and that means taking serious measurement and enforcement efforts that go along with the new rules. It's not enough just to put some rules on the books, and these belong in national policy, in all the places where apparel production is crucial, but also in private regulation. But having said that, we're not talking here just about codes of conduct. Given the seriousness and the urgency of climate adaptation, what we really mean is not voluntary programs, but binding agreements that include workers, suppliers, and brands. The last recommendation from us is chiefly for governments, and that it's that they integrate climate adaptation and worker rights related factors into their trade policies and trade agreements. And that also means tailoring reporting requirements and due diligence rules to the needs of climate adaptation, and as Angus said, not just mitigation. We see the new regulations coming in Europe, and their focus too is largely on mitigation, not adaptation. So adaptation and worker health need to be priorities in the trade policy, in the policy making at the EU and the US level. Those are still the major markets for apparel and footwear production globally. And I'd say that at Cornell, we're not. This was not framed as a win-win analysis, and Schroders is a very clear-eyed outfit. But we can see from the analyses argue that these sorts of investments in climate adaptation make sense almost regardless of your perspective, whether you're concerned about protecting workers or protecting earnings or managing risk for employers and governments, brands and investors, or for some constituents, all three. So we're anxious that this analysis get good uptake, and we're interested too to hear what the reactions from the panel are. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you, Jason, Angus, for that overview. And I know that was a lot to digest. There's a link to the full report in the chat for anyone who wants to check it out. And a recording of this will be available later as well. So you can watch back over it and digest everything in more detail. But to summarize very briefly what Jason and Angus were saying is these are risks that are material, they're meaningful, they're already here, and within a very short amount of time stand to cost the industry billions of dollars and millions of jobs if no action is taken to address them. But I think, we're still talking quite high level, and I wanted to start, Kalpona, by asking you to share some perspective on what things are like in Dhaka today. I know you speak daily with people working in the factories. How are these conditions we're talking about affecting people working in the industry right now?
Thank you so much, Sarah. This research is very relevant. The facts talk about that, how the workers are in here. Like, the heat rises in last couple of years, and it is increasing every year. It is not decreasing. And with that, it is the flood and rain that is also making workers' lives more difficult. Like, some new diseases just add on in workers' lives, like they get frightened, oversweating, exhaustion, they feel fever. So all those wasn't there, and it is increasing, like pretty much. We experience when we're talking to the workers that this is happening every day in the factory, and there is most of the factory doesn't have any precaution or any new add-on to protect workers from there. End of the work shift, workers feel they're that exhausted that they don't have any strength even to walking to home. And many of them, like when they go to home, due to like low wages that our workers are getting, they cannot even, like, ceiling fan is a luxury. They cannot even think of any air conditioning in their houses. And with that, it is more crisis adds the power cuts that is workers face when they just get their home. So that caused them not to get enough sleep, and then that caused them not to be productive in following morning. So this sickness increasing their absenteeism in the factory. Like, sick leave is not necessarily that it is very common that factories are approving. So they just stay at home without giving a sick, as they will not get that leave. So they get wage cut. So there is a wage gap happen. And when it is rain happen, so they get overflood, they get flooding in their houses, because those houses not like in a building that, they will be save themselves, like whatever belongs they have, they just get drowned. And they cannot come to the factory for that day or those days. And that also caused them losing their money for those particular days. And also, if anyone required to get their attendance bonus, they also lose that. So their monthly planning within that the wages they get, that become a real mismatch in real life. So the heat rising and this climate change, the workers are affecting every single way, but the conversation is not there. The conversation, like in effect, workers level, the conversation is not there, because yet them to identify that they're affecting by the climate vulnerability, and that is leading them to get sickness or overflooding or power cut, all these they're facing. And the conversation not being started with the manufacturers level as well. So that is not there. The factory is not providing like extra cooling system or putting like more exhaust fan, making the factory cool. Like when it is 35 degrees Celsius in outside, you should add on like another 10 degree in the factory. And it's not a joke for them to work in that condition, but they don't have any choice. We found that very few factory providing workers the oral saline, so they can just drink that, but it is just for a specific section, like Ironmans, because they, top of this heat, the extra heat, they're working in a finishing section, in an iron section. So few workers are getting that, but it is not allocating for every worker. So the vulnerability with the workers are really, really increasing pretty much like every day.
Thank you, Kalpona. And I think, that point you make reflects what Jason and Angus were saying, which is that even if these impacts are already becoming more evident, the conversation around how to address and adapt to them isn't yet happening on a wide scale, it sounds like, at any level. But, Anne, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, as a manufacturer, how are you looking at this? How is this? How are you thinking about this issue?
Okay, so of course the climate issue is not joking. What Jason as well as Angus has mentioned is indeed happening, and in the last few months or this year alone, I think the heat has risen up all average about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius all over, including in Indonesia. But the thing is with Pan Brothers, we have about 22 factories, and some of them are old, some of them are the newest versions. So what we did actually in the last 10 years, we actually put an air cooling system within the factory floors. The reason is quite simple and logic, because the less heat the workers actually feel, the more productive they are. I mean, it's pretty common sense. So actually there's a technical and physiological ideas on this. But of course, I do understand that some of the factories might not have the means to do it because of cost-wise. But I think the issues, and I hear about what Bangladesh as well as the rest of the less country on this. And I think the whole supply chain also need to understand that low minimum wage doesn't mean low human rights, right? Lower human rights. So I think it correlates. The issues, again, I think it's not only about how we are actually mitigating this, which we are right now, but actually how the end users understand this garment industry works. The whole supply chain itself is pretty tight right now. I think all over the world we should see about inflations. I think on our clothing industry, we have the lowest inflations in overall compared to the other sectors like food and transportations. But how actually the end users respect us within the clothing ecosystem, from the brands, from the garment makers, from the workers, from the textile. Actually, that is our homework, all of our homework. This is a change of mindset, right? It's not a mindset only to mitigate the climate, but also a mindset how to humanize the clothing industry for all. Right.
So it's about communicating.
Yes, it's communicating how to produce more quality, how to actually produce garments in a way where there is no post-sales waste. When I said about post-sales, sometimes I saw a lot of excessive stocks in the market that you have to recycle back. I think it's a shame. It's a sin actually to look at it. And the people who work behind it, all the workers, the manufacturing, the brands, and the whole supply chain, actually excessively producing it. But we do not really humanize the clothing industry. I think this is a mind-boggling for all. But the transformation has to be just for all the supply chain, because climate issues is everyone responsibility. It's not only the workers, it's not only the manufacturing, it's not only the brands, but actually the end users really have to have the same mindset as us. And that's the challenge, right?
Yeah, I think you raised some really interesting points there, and I think we'll get into a lot more of them. But before we do, Mick, I'm going to throw this over to you, because I feel like if we're talking about changing mindsets and how people think about the industry, the brands like PVH are in the most powerful position to help influence that. Why do you think this conversation isn't happening on a broader level, not just towards consumers, as Anne was potentially saying, but within the industry as well?
No, thank you, Sarah. And I think it's a very fair question. And I suppose I'd address it from a narrow and a broad level, just reflecting on the comments that Kalpona made. When I was working for the Accord in Dhaka for almost 3 years, this was a recurring issue.
Mick, hang on. sorry to interrupt, just in case everyone isn't aware of your background, do you just want to very briefly break down what the Accord is and what you were doing for it?
Oh, yeah. So the Accord is a legally binding agreement between global retailers, global brands and trade unions, initially started in Bangladesh and now expanding to Pakistan. And I had the great honor of working with Kalpona in helping to set up the Accord. She made a much bigger role than I did back in 2013. And then in 2016, I moved to Dhaka and worked for the Accord for almost 3 years. So yeah, apologies for that lack of context. But in the Accord in Dhaka, you know, there's a safety standard that's there, and it's on fire, structural, electrical. And then later we began to look at a lot of occupational safety, but through the prism of fire, structural, electrical. We did not have a standard on, you know, the heat indices or heat exhaustion. However, one of the aspects of the Accord is the right of all workers not to work in an unsafe environment. And there's also a complaints mechanism, which when I was at the Accord, I was responsible for administering. And we got a lot of complaints through the complaint mechanism about factories being too hot. And we then did develop a response standard where we send engineers to factories to assess the temperature, require cooling methods where appropriate. But again, that was only where we got complaints from factories. It wasn't like we went out to the entire factory base and assessed proactively the heat indices. But again, that's on a narrow perspective within Bangladesh where you had the Accord mechanism. And then within that, we had to use the Bangladeshi Labor Code, which isn't exact about temperatures, it just talks in a more general way. I think to address your question from a broader, more global perspective, why this issue is not being addressed. I think, look, fashion is a fast industry, not just fast fashion. All fashion is a fast industry. And from a commercial perspective, brands are grappling with day-to-day crises in the supply chain all the time. And it's difficult to get away from those daily crises that you encounter and take a more longer term view. And how do you get that? I think, as Jason stated, from a human rights and climate perspective, look, brands have set targets to do things like reduce carbon emissions, you know, provide living wages, etc. And that's the focus. But why is that? Because in selling markets, we've seen events like, you know, never mind record temperatures, but fires and flooding in places like the US and Europe, which we haven't seen before. So consumers care about the environment, and that's why brands are leaning in. But I don't think we've ever had a study of this granularity on the future impact of these issues at a factory level. And that's why this report is so valuable, because it will enable, in my view, those brands who take this research seriously to take the adaptive measures recommended. So I think it's a real opportunity and a wake-up call.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating point, that this kind of level of data and insight hasn't been available until now. And it will be really interesting to see what the industry does with this and what investors do with it. You know, Anne, I think you also raised some really tricky points about how any form of adaptation fits within a just transition. I'm curious to hear a bit more from you. You know, if manufacturers are having to retrofit factories and find other solutions, what could they look like, and how do you balance the costs and the opportunity here? Do you have some perspective on that?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So of course, like I said, we have about 22 factories in Indonesia across Java Island. We start first with one at that time. When you look at my virtual background, this is actually since 2014, since before Paris 2020. And this is real, even though at this moment, my background is virtual, but this is real. This is our Central Java first green office platinum in Central Java. So, so we start first with the one factory, and we see the outcome when we do this air cooling. You know, what kind of productivity that we see. And it turns out actually it's not bad. So we experienced the second one, and it's actually better. Then, you know, we start to think, when we built at that time a newer version of factory, then we start to build in a cooling factor within it. the roof, as well as the way the window is being put on. So in a way, the newer versions of the factory, we built in the climate effect of the world. But back then, of course, it's still traditional, so we have to actually attach a lot of things so to make the building is cooler. The humidity is actually as if, because we are producing garment, right? We don't want to have more humid and then we got mold within the garment that we produce. So there are a lot of actually technical things that we put into a layout that ensuring actually the workers can actually still produce well. But then the costs actually, even though we add in first, but then we actually can be more cost effective. To add that, actually, the government of each country should also focus on how to reduce the carbon emissions. Michael said something good about carbon emissions. Actually, this is a sad thing, but I have to say this. Yeah, not everyone is ready to actually calculate our carbon footprint. Not everyone. We have scope 1, we have scope 2, we have scope 3. Pan Brothers being the largest garment exporter in Indonesia, we are quite advanced than others. But we always said this in the community, especially me. I'm in the International Apparel Federation board. We always say that no one is going to be left behind. But is it really no one going to be left behind? Because it's really not easy to push all of our peers to calculate our carbon emissions. Pan Brothers this year is going to establish our reports on carbon footprint, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I've seen the calculations SBTI based. Scope 1, scope 3 is not bad. Scope 1 and scope 2 is not bad. We are going to have a good, clean net zero by 2040 on scope 1, scope 2. But scope 3 is challenging. I'm not even sure we could push 2045. We want to, but it's not only up to us, right? So again, the climate issues is indeed a challenge for all of us. It also can be a threat, but I'm always positive-minded, right? It's a challenge for a human being. Why we are being born with brain is actually to actually handle this challenge. And if we are human enough, all of us should be able to handle this well. Both with the brands, both with the suppliers, both with our workers. And of course, we have to continue advocating our government, our regulators to actually help us to ensure that the renewable energy, whatever it is that we have to make too. And that's the reason why we are being born, right? As a human.
Thanks for sharing. Thanks, Angus. I think you unpacked a lot of complexity there, and I want to pick up on the point you made that the idea is that no one should get left behind, but in practice, you're not so confident that would happen. And Angus, I want to follow up on a point you made. You were very careful when you were talking about how brands or how the industry should approach adaptation to say, in cases where a factory's risk exposure cannot be mitigated, companies should look at relocating to somewhere nearby. But what is the risk that people within the industry will look at studies like this, see where the highest risk exposures are, and just say, well, that is not where I'm going to source anymore? So you see a shift in sourcing, companies cutting and running, and a potentially very damaging change in the way trade flows.
Yeah, it's a super question, Sarah, and a very difficult one. You're right in pointing out the balance that needs to be struck, or the tightrope that must be walked. I think I've heard one of the best lines I've heard all week from Anne earlier when she said we need to humanize the supply chain, because that is exactly what we're talking about here in an industry which is incredibly labor intensive. So it is built on humans to begin with. But when it comes to the debate around retrofit versus relocate, for starters, we think that there is quite possibly a more attractive ROI associated with the retrofit option in certain circumstances. Actually, the reality is that if we look at these production centers, the skilled labor forces, the capacity has been built up over many, many years. It takes time. It's not so easy just to say, okay, you know what, we're going to go and build a new factory 20 miles up the road, because sourcing the labor, but buying the equipment, securing the funding is actually, far easier said than done. So for starters, we believe that there is a meaningful ROI that is attractive enough, and certainly positive and accretive to the earnings profiles of the actors within the industry to seek out retrofit options. The other sort of headwind we believe there is associated with relocation is capacity. There were, when we assessed the bottom-up scenario analyses presented in the individual brand TCFD reports, there was one company that did speak to a sort of shadow supply chain that had been established in the event that they needed to relocate supply. And that's quite a striking and profound thing for them to be doing. But it realistically, there aren't very many centers globally that are A, insulated from these kind of climate risks, B, flush with enough skilled workers to be able to produce the capacity that is required, and C, going to be able to do so in the near term, such that relocation is a big opportunity for the vast majority of players in this industry. So we don't think that necessarily it is the most appealing, but as you say, of course, there will be these situations where, particularly when it comes to flood, which, according to some of the conversations that we had with industry actors over the course of doing this research, is typically viewed as a much more intangible or more challenging thing to adapt for because of the sporadic nature of floods and so on. There will be people who say, well, look, when that happens, it's going to be a shock. It's going to be a shock to the system. It's going to be hard to justify the adaptation there. You may build flood defenses or floodgates or something like that, and it may not flood for 3 years, and you'll be looking at your finance officers sort of having to justify that expenditure. And in those scenarios, we think that really it absolutely critical is the engagement with workers, the engagement with the worker stakeholder, to make sure that there are provisions that are made to work out how to ensure that people are given opportunities. They are either given reskilling opportunities or given opportunities to work in a nearby location, obviously depending on how nearby we are talking. But to be really honest with you, Sarah, it's a challenging one that all participants in the industry have to grapple with. Most importantly, the regulators as well, because there are very significant regulatory issues that need to be addressed to ensure the requisite protections for the worker actors. And I see Jason has come off mute. I think he probably is going to add something on that point.
Hey, well, just this, that sourcing strategies are really a function of many things, many variables, chief among them price, delivery, quality, et cetera. So our argument is not that climate vulnerability trumps all those other values, all those other measures, but that it needs to be in the list. And the sooner buyers, suppliers, unions, investors begin insisting on investments or making investments in adaptation, the more likely it is that these industries will be able to stay where they are. And as Angus said, if it's in the mind of the brand to cut and run because of climate vulnerabilities, there aren't many places to go. Other places are climate vulnerable in similar ways. And the capacity that's been built up in China, Southeast Asia, South Asia over the last 20 plus years is not easy to replicate in other parts of the world, Northern Africa, Central America, et cetera. So cut and run doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's not an obvious place to go.
Mick, I think you have something to add on this as well, and then I want to jump over to some questions because I know we're tight on time, and I want to there are some really interesting questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I'll keep it super quick, Sarah, because I know we got to get the time and we're coming up on the hour. But yeah, I think on the to address directly the questions that Angus and Jason made about whether brands cut and run, I would point again to the Accord model. I think crucially as we address this, it has to be done collectively, and particularly from 213 on, there were provisions in the accord that said if a factory had to have a substantial retrofit, particularly around structural, or if a factory had to move, and that happened especially in shared buildings where the landlord was not willing to make the necessary investments, that it was actually brands that underwrote workers' wages and gave commercial terms necessary to enable those changes to happen. That hasn't happened a lot since maybe 2015 or so, but certainly in the early part of the accord, they were there and the parties were around the table, including the unions, talking about, okay, what's the best way? Can we retrofit the factory? Is it easier to move? And if so, how do we make sure workers don't lose salary? Sorry for jumping in there,
No,
but I just wanted to share that.
It's a really good jumping off point for the first question we have in the chat, which is from Public Eye. And they ask, the research and the conversation seems to come from an assumption that the current dominant business model and the power inequalities that it reflects are not going to change. And we're sort of trying to work to adapt within that framework. But doing the research, Jason, did you consider the option for more fundamental changes in how the industry operates, and whether that could make a significant difference, and what that would look like?
Yeah. So right at the top of the paper, we deal with this question about the business models that dominate in fashion, and the question of unending growth and excessive consumption are problems we don't take on in the paper. They contribute enormously to the climate breakdown. But we don't have scope in this paper to get at those. We do, though, spend a lot of time later in the paper talking about the role of regulators, and in particular, the power of the threat, the reality in Europe of legal liability for brands for harms done to workers. And you can surely count extreme heat and its effects on worker health, or the impacts of unmitigated, undefended an absence of flood defenses around factories as harms to workers, and those can be pushed up to the level of lead buyer liability. Now, those aren't questions that are answered in the current directive in the European Union, the due diligence directive and the reporting directive that accompanies it. They describe these problems A, in terms of mitigation, or B, in very, very vague terms of worker health and safety. They can be tightened significantly, and it's the question of legal liability that will drive the sorts of investments that brands and suppliers make in the coming years. So it wasn't our goal to sort of rewrite the business model or business models for fashion, but to deal with this very urgent problem of adaptation.
And Angus, I'm curious also if you have some perspective on that from an investor standpoint.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I think I completely agree with everything Jason has said. I would point the person who asked the question to the second report, where we do spend quite a lot of time trying to unpack the history of the buyer-supplier relationship, and how this business model has evolved. And the sentiment behind the question is exactly right. What is so striking when you look at the evolution of this industry is how the supply chain has been incredibly flexible. The supply chain has responded pretty much to the beck and call of the brands, to the point where over sort of 20 years worth of quarterly inventory cover, for example, so just how much supply is being produced by the suppliers to cover the forward-looking sales for brands, the brands are almost never short. The suppliers really are responsive, and we look at, for example, the wages in the supply chain and the wages as a proportion of retail prices and so on. To Jason's point, there are inherent flaws, as I think the question identifies, in the current business model. But from where we sit as investors, we have to encourage our companies to act in the bounds of the law. We need to see that binding legal and regulatory change to create the platform for us to have a lot more bite when we are engaging with companies on some of these issues. So that is a really important point. But at the same time, it's also an important thing to acknowledge that, the effects of acute heat and flooding are being felt today. So, in the incumbent business model, it may be very, very sort of enticing to talk about the alternative business model arrangements that could be created. You know, a world where we have much lower consumption, much lower overconsumption, and so on. But the reality is there are still workers going into factories every day, suffering the consequences of extreme heat and flooding, and thus, exactly as Jason has said, that importance of adaptation was the key that we wanted to bring to the fore, because as we've seen in our brand analysis, it is not often front of mind, because mitigation is the thing that has been prioritized historically.
It's such a fascinating point. There's so much there. I know Mick has a hard stop and has to jump off. There are a few more questions I might try and whiz through, but Mick, if you have to leave, we will regret not having your insights for the next few questions, but very much appreciate your being on.
Apologies, and thanks, Sarah, and a huge thanks to Cornell and Schroders for the research.
Thanks, Mick. For those of you who can't stay, I will whiz through these last few questions. But Kalpona, question here on how it might be best to start worker conversations on this topic, and what might be the best approaches for worker education. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
Thank you, Sarah. So, you know, the best option is to start the workers' conversation. You know, all the plan we need to do with centering workers' voice, that is important. Like all the policies or discussion that happened regarding climate and workers' vulnerability, the workers' voice is not been included yet. So the best way is them to bring in the every discussion table. So that is important. And the discussion through the independent union, just, you know, in the independent union, not like union that everyone talks about. So through that independent union, that can be a debate discussion or tripartite discussion that can be started with the manufacturers and the government. And when the business, like brands and manufacturers speak, they need to make sure that workers' voice also been included, because when we are talking about losing business, a huge stake is workers as well, because you know, without them, the industry it will be quite impossible. So that need to be recognized. I know that Mick has, you know, talked about Accord, and then the work Accord has been done in here and regarding you know, heat and others, but we also need to share that the beauty of Accord is not remaining same in Bangladesh, especially when their successor like RMG Sustainable Council take over. Everything is not same that used to be. So that need to be discussed as well. So main thing that every single state, every single places, the workers' voice need to be included, so the conversation can be start from there.
Thank you, Kalpona. And I'm going to make time for one more question. There's a lot more here, so hopefully people will sort of engage afterwards. I'm sorry that we are running out of time. But Jason, you know, we've touched a little bit on the importance of standards and regulations here. But what are the key pieces of regulation that could help? And what are the metrics we should be looking for to understand if adaptation is happening and effective?
Yeah, good one. Well, I think the lowest of the low-hanging fruit is simply setting standards. Take heat, for example, setting standards for workplace temperature. We looked at, for the 4 countries that we focused on here, we looked at what's in national law, labor law, and other regulation. And some of the regulations are sort of hopelessly vague in terms like comfortable or tolerable, and that means nothing to an assessor who has to make a decision about whether or not heat is excessive at the factory level. Of the 4 countries that we looked at, Vietnam had the clearest and most stringent standard. You can see those in the report, in report 1. Enforcement is another question, and there are obvious problems with enforcement. We look to it private regulation. So what are the multi-stakeholder initiatives, SLCP, the ILO Better Work Program? What do they say about heat and ventilation and worker leave and hydration? All of that also cataloged in report 1. There was one standout there, and it's the ILO's Better Work Standard, and in particular, the ILO's program in Cambodia, the only one of the 4 countries where we were able to get data, thanks to the ILO, showing us what the indoor temperatures are at the heat of the day in all of the workplaces that are part of that program. The other 3 countries don't do anything comparable. So one of the simplest things to do, both public and private, is to begin collecting and reporting those heat and humidity levels. And Sarah, before I hand back the mic, we want to recognize the ILO for sharing their data. It makes for a very interesting case study in report 1. We also had help from BRAC University in Dhaka, from Intensil, which is a climate vulnerability analysis firm in Hong Kong and Singapore. And we also had help from the Catalyst Institute. So important case studies in both reports were contributed by others. We want to thank them.
And it's fascinating to hear how difficult it is even to get basic data on this as well. We are over time, so I'm sorry I didn't get through all of the questions. There's some really interesting ones there, so I hope this has been a conversation starter rather than a full stop. Jason, Angus, Anne, and Kalpona, thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how this moves forward from here, and I hope this was a good start to people's days in the US and to people's days in Asia and wherever you are. I hope this has been illuminating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.